transitioning now from 4s to 7s. Josh and I are both 7s, and that's what 7s do. As we've chatted this week, last couple weeks, we're very different and yet really, really the same. And when you describe a 7, just transitioning from 4s, when you describe a 7, a 7 is someone that just embodies joy, a boundless love for life. They love to travel. They crave stimulation, playful, adventuresome. Just the eternal sunshine is what they call them. And when you ask a 7, how much is enough? They're going to say, a little bit more. Just a little bit more. Let's just keep going. But my wife says that I have a strong tendency to constantly see only the bright side of the story. And I avoid the deeper emotions or the hard feelings like the plague, which is hard to hear. But as you and I have been talking, how does this relate to you?
I feel like you've just described my whole life. Ever since I was a kid, I had this longing for adventure. And 7s tend to be really optimistic people. They want the next fun thing in life. And they see life as glass half full.
Overflowing.
Not a half full, it's totally
all the way full,
running over.
all over the floor, and that's great.
They see life as this beautiful gift from God, and so they want to experience all of it. That when God created the world, it truly was good, and so I need to find out about all of it. And so as we've been processing through all of this, I asked my wife when she first noticed some of these qualities in my life, and she said, from the very first time I met you. And so I was thinking back, and we used to work at a coffee shop in Texas together. That's where we met, Starbucks coffee shop. And she was going to school down in Texas, and her family was all in Iowa, but her birthday was coming up. So we were just friends at this point, just coworkers. And I thought, I want to throw her a surprise party. I want to make it the best surprise party that she'll ever have in her life. And so we had a shift together, and I asked if I could borrow her car to go up to the store. And she said yes, but what she didn't know is that I was going up to the store to make a copy of her apartment key.
That's not creepy.
So I had this elaborate plan where I had a friend on her birthday take her out to lunch, and while she was at lunch, we went in her apartment and we started decorating it, and we brought in a cake. And we invited a bunch of friends over, and she had a tiny apartment. It was around 300 square feet, so a tiny little apartment. So, there's people in her bathroom and bedroom and kitchen, and so she comes back from the lunch, and we all jump out and surprise her, and it was awesome. And it never once occurred to me that could possibly be seen as creepy. But when I tell people now, they're like, that's really creepy. How could you do that?
You could have done 3 to 5.
It's breaking and entering. 3 to 5 years. But it worked out. It worked out. She did want her key back, but it worked out. We've been married 19 years now.
There you go. So the thing is with 7s is oftentimes in our mind, and you've talked about this as well, we have this moment where like, this is brilliant. Like I don't even know how to stop myself. For example, we were remodeling a house that we were living in, and I was trimming out this window in the kitchen. My wife had been asking me for months, and I'm sitting there putting in the finish work, and on this wall, it was just this solid wall. It was towards the west, and I'm like, there really should be a window there. And I tried not to think about it. I tried to ignore it. And then I just got out my saw and I just cut a giant hole in the wall. And she came home and she's like, why is there a hole in the wall? I'm like, this wall really needs a window. It took me 3 years to finish that window.
Is there a window now?
There's a window, but I moved, so I don't care.
No, I relate to that. So many times things they seem like a great idea in the moment, right? And on our first anniversary, I had this brilliant idea. We were going to Colorado to visit this really cool little town. And I thought, well, why don't we find out what the best hotel is in town? But we're not going to take anybody else's word for it, so we're going to go and find out. So in the week that we were there, we stayed at a different hotel every single night, checking out, dragging our bags across the street, checking into a new hotel. It was a terrible idea.
That's dumber than cutting a hole in a wall.
And if you go on a trip, I'm telling you, do not do that. Find a hotel and take other people's word for it.
So we have this fear of missing out. Like even in the smallest things. When I go to a restaurant, it's hard. Because what if I misorder? That's most people like no big deal. For me, it's like, I struggle in this moment. You talked about that.
Oh, that's the worst. When I'm on tour with my band, the Afters, they say that I interrogate the waiter when we got to eat. And so I have all these questions that I'll ask the waiter about the menu. You know, what's your favorite thing on the menu? When I say what's the best thing on the menu and they say everything, that is the worst.
They're
That's
liars.
not true. Everything is not the best. There's one best thing. And so I'll ask, you know, what do people love to order? You know, what's the most popular thing? What's the one thing that I should not leave here without trying? And so the guys used to give me a really hard time about it. And they would kind of tease me about it. But what started happening is they'd bring out the food, and they'd all have order envy. And they'd be looking at my plate and saying, you have the best plate. That looks so good. And I said, of course. I'm asking the right questions.
There you go.
So now when we go out to eat, my guitar player, Matt, he'll just say, I'm having whatever Josh is having.
You know, there's a thing, though, as we look through who we are and these fun sides of a 7, but 7s have this tendency to always be seeking out the next experience or the next adventure, and it's like this roller coaster of adventures. How do you deal with that?
I feel like it can become exhausting sometimes because as 7s, there's times that we have as much fun planning the trip as we do actually going on the trip. And sometimes when we're in the middle of adventure, we're already planning the next adventure. And so we can start living in the future and get distracted and scattered. And for 7s to grow healthy, we have to realize that the most beautiful things in life happen right here in the present.
Yeah. And it's hard because, and I'm learning this as I go through this process, we have a hard time confronting the painful or the emotional things, and so we just avoid them.
It's hard. You know, I feel like I've done that my whole life. And I've been becoming more aware of that. But we have a hard time processing pain. We have a hard time going to those hurtful places. A lot of times we operate on half emotions. And we'll even reframe the bad things as good things. And, you know, there's a time and place for that, but we have to be able to access the hard emotions, and especially for the people around us, go to those places. I remember there was a time when my family got into a big car accident, and we hit a car going down the highway. We flipped our car and ended up upside down in a ditch. And that night, a time when I should have been fully engaged with my family and really processing through the emotions of what just happened, my mind was already thinking about what the next car was going to be. I was already getting on the internet and planning what car we're going to have and the better features we were going to have, and we're going to have a better sound system, better all these things, and it was not helpful. Yeah. And it disconnected me from my family in a time when I needed to be fully engaged. And you know, Kara, my wife, she's really been good about sharing how when you are disconnected emotionally in the hard times, it's really hard.
Yeah.
And when you are vulnerable and you engage in those things, it's good for our relationship because I know how hard it is for you. And when you are able to go through those things and process, even through the painful things, it makes us better. It's healthy for our relationship.
And I'm going to share on this in a minute, but it's hard where it feels like there's this wall around those emotions, specifically when we're in a smaller group of 1 to 2 or 5 people in this small setting. For me, when I'm here, it's as if this is my own personal therapy session. So I apologize to all of you, but preaching oftentimes becomes this moment where I can be vulnerable because it feels safer in an odd way.
I feel like the same way with songwriting. You know, I think early on in my life, I realized I would have these painful feelings, and I didn't know what to do with them. And so I'd go write a song, and I realized that feels like therapy. And so oftentimes when I go through something hard in life, I'll put it to a lyric and a melody. And I think to be healthy 7s, though, we need to realize that is a place we have to go. Mm-hmm. We have to learn to operate in a full range of emotions, to walk through those hard times with friends. I have a lot of friends who are 4s, and 4s can be amazing in helping us walk through those places in our life, and because they have so much empathy for it. But we also have to learn not to live in the future. Right. That it's not always greener or more fun off on the other side in the future, but that God has us where we are for a reason, and that when we slow down and look at our life and what's around us right now in the present, we're going to see God's fingerprints and see him working in our lives right now. So that's something that I work on every day.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks.
You know, as we look at 7s and who we are as individuals, it's interesting for me to look in Scripture. And as I was diving through it, looking at like who is a good example of that, and I struggled trying to figure that out for a while. And then I read this passage out of Ecclesiastes, and it's a fascinating passage because it's at the end of Solomon's life in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. And he's looking back at his life and how he was living and what he's been doing. And it's as if he's living in an unhealthy place, looking back at who he is. And so this is what it says. It says, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. My mind is still guiding me with wisdom, and I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. If you take that last sentence right there, that's a 7 to the T. I wanted to see what was good for people to do. I could tell you story after story after story of seasons in my life when I was pursuing things that were good. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but that's all I was after. And I avoided those other hard areas because I really just wanted to live in the good. And so when I started reading through the Enneagram months ago, honestly, at first it was really spooky. Like, it was weird because I read through a lot of the different types, and some of them were just completely foreign to me. But when I read about the 7s, it was like somebody reached into my soul, pulled out who I was, and put it in a book. And I didn't authorize it. And there were times when I'm reading, I was embarrassed. I was like, I can't believe other people can read this about me. You know, we go through seasons in our life. You can look at a 7 and you can say, well, they're an unhealthy 7 or a healthy 7. Here's 2 examples. An unhealthy 7, for example, and I've shared this story before, but now looking at it in my mindset of, I was in Guatemala, I've got 5 students in my car with me, I was the youth pastor, we're driving down the road, they have police stops everywhere, and they're meaningless. And so as I'm driving up to one of these police stops, he comes in the road, he's got a machine gun on, and he just does this to me. And I just did this to him and went around him and kept going, as you do. And so as I'm driving, all the guys in the car were all kind of giggling, and then I look in the rearview mirror and I don't say anything, but I see the cops all jumping in the back of their truck, and they take off towards me. I'm like, that's probably not good. And so I just keep going. I'm like, if I take a right and a left and a right and a left, right, then maybe they won't see me, but they did. They found me. And so I pulled over on the side of the road, windows down, hands up. They jump out, machine guns drawn, and completely surround the vehicle. And then he starts yelling at me, why didn't you stop, in Spanish? And I said to him, no habla español. And he said, what's wrong with you? No habla español. And he just keeps yelling at me, lo siento, which means sorry. And everything he's saying, I understood exactly what he said. No habla español. And then I heard him say in Spanish to the rest of his crew, whatever they're called, this American's an idiot. Let's just leave him. We scared him good enough. And they get in their vehicle and they drive away. And in the back seat, you hear this, where they all start laughing. And they're like, Paul, you understood what he said. I said, uh-huh. Every word. Why didn't you stop back there? I just thought it'd be fun. And honestly, that was the extent. That was as deep as I went. Let's see what happens when 10 machine guns are drawn on you. Why not? Now, on the flip side of that, when I grow to be in a healthy place, even in those moments, there's situations like this. This was given to me, Haiti, 2014. This was the team that I brought from the Grove. That's the picture that's on this cup. They give me this cup, and on it says, Paul Gunther Jr., Pastor of Adventures. And I was like, Pastor of Adventures? Are you kidding me? That's like being an Avenger and a pastor. It's like the greatest thing ever. Like, literally, that's where I went. But then as 7s, we get so spun out of control. I was looking at that picture, and I'm like, I remember that moment. And in that moment, what I was really thinking is I was up on top of this mountain, looking over this canyon at this amazing scenery. I'm standing on top of this mountain. It's unbelievable. And I remember thinking, yeah, I want to go home. I want to go visit my family. I want to go hang out with my kids. I'm done. But we had like 3 days left in the trip. But here's what I tell people. Standing up on the top of that mountain, my team was behind us. And as they're all standing there, all of a sudden these warriors came up and they started shooting arrows at me. And I stood in front of the whole team, and I protected them, and I blocked all those arrows with the staff, and it got a little crazy. At one point, the dragons came up. And those dragons came up, and they started blowing fire, but I blocked it. I protected my team. I brought them back to safety, brought them back to America, and the team survived. And that's the kind of nonsense that literally goes through my head. I really went there. And that took me 4 years to get that picture done because I was like, I got to figure out how to get some arrows and a dragon in there because maybe people will believe that I actually am the pastor of adventures. Then I started diving deeper into the Enneagram and started looking into these thoughts of who we are as people. And here's what it says about sevens. It says sevens avoid pain and fear by escaping into pleasure, fun, and imagination. I've never done that. And then it says that they reframe everything as positive to eliminate negativity and pain. It says they're always thinking ahead towards better possibilities and more enjoyment. Their future orientation leads to difficulty with commitment and follow through. I read that list, I'm not kidding you, 50 times because I was like, what in the world are they talking about? I thought sevens were just fun and full of adventure. The person they use, the example they use for a seven is Peter Pan. And I remember reading that and going, Peter Pan, absolutely, greatest thing ever. Who wouldn't want to be Peter Pan? And a friend of mine who's a 4 looked at me, he goes, Peter Pan never grew up. And your problem? I literally don't see any problem with that. But then dealing with that word, pain and fear, that was foreign. Like literally, that was out of left field. And that took me to a deep place where I really had to start processing and thinking about, okay, then who am I? Now, if I'm going to tell you my story in under 1 minute, I'll tell you this. I grew up in Washington, lived on the back of a forest with 300 acres, made tree forts all day long, underground forts, explored streams, went hiking, would be gone literally all day as like an 8-year-old, walk through, get a sandwich, back out in the woods. That's how I grew up. In 6th grade, my parents, within a week or two's notice, told me, hey, we're moving to Bangkok. Cool, let's go. Went to Bangkok, Thailand, lived there. After a week and a half, they sent me to a boarding school, Penang, Malaysia. Lived on this island right on the ocean, and next to us was this jungle filled with all these World War II bunkers. And junior high for me was spent with living with all these other junior high kids. It was Lord of the Flies, but I was the good guy. And then my dad bought a ticket where all we had to do was fly west. And so we went all through India, all through Europe. High school, I moved to Montana. Weekends were spent exploring ghost towns, cliff jumping, caving, rock climbing, even work. I owned a construction company, did music, was in the film industry, worked with VeggieTales and bought the tomato, did all these amazing things. And when I look back, I'm like, where is the pain and the suffering? Because that's amazing. And then I read sevens look at their life as a giant adventure and they reframe everything as if it was good. Like, wait a minute. Like, this is reaching into your soul kind of stuff. Solomon, as he's speaking and writing in Ecclesiastes, as he's looking back, and keep in mind he's in an unhealthy place. This defines who a 7 is. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born into my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces, and I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well. The delights of a man's heart, I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. As a 7 in their 20s, and I think we all as individuals have a tendency to want to become great, but as a 7 that drives us. When he talked about in the very beginning, he said, I undertook great projects. I could list a laundry list of projects that I've started, and I finished maybe 60% of them. And it was just constantly bouncing from one thing to the next. And then Solomon writes this at the very end. He says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desires. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all of my labor. And this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I survived all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. You know, there comes a maturity with just life, with just living, with getting to places in our life where we look back and go, man, that's an experience I don't know if I'd change, but I don't think I should do that again. And Allie last week when she talked about, at the end of her sermon, she says, I don't even know if I'm a 2. I might be a 6. And that's where we should be in our teens and our 20s as we look at the Enneagram. We look at our 20s and early in life and how our experiences shape who we are, and we get into our 30s and we begin to think about who we are as individuals. And sometime in our 30s or 40s, we begin to process, is this who I am? Is this healthy? Is this who I am made to be? I got to fix some of this stuff in my life. In Proverbs, at the beginning of Solomon's life, he said, let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Give careful thought to the paths for your feet and be steadfast in all your ways. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Keep your foot from evil. Do not turn to the right or the left. And that's the problem. Is it so easy, and in our language, my language, fun, to jump over here or to jump over there or to be bouncing all over the place and to realize that I'm keeping everything kind of at a distance. I remember when we had the panel that was sitting over here with some of our staff. I was sitting up there with my wife, and they were talking about certain fears that drive them or hold them back and how it shapes each number. And I leaned over to my wife and I said, do 7s, do we have a fear? And she looked at me like I was crazy. She's like, do you have a fear? I'm like, yeah, I'm scared of snakes, but I don't think that shaped who I am. She goes, yeah, you have a fear. I'm like, I honestly, I don't know what my fear is. She goes, exactly. Exactly what? What are you talking about? She said, 7s have a tendency to live in your head because if you let those thoughts or those struggles or those pains, if you let those go down to your heart, you have to deal with your emotions, and that's scary for you. And you fear that. So you take your fears, you put them in a box, and you bury them. I'm like, I do this? She's like, yeah, your whole life. And it just absolutely blew my mind. In the Enneagram book, one of the things it says 7s often carry a deep childhood wound or fear, which they try to avoid at all costs. When I carry a childhood wound, you heard my story. So I was sitting down with my wife and I said, okay, I need help with this because my story is Peter Pan. It is amazing. She goes, can I retell your story for you? I'm like, sure. Kind of already know it because I lived it. Have at it. She said, you lived this amazing life as a kid, exploring the forest, living outside. And then on a week or two's notice, your family moved to Bangkok and you left everything. She goes, and then when you were just starting to get comfortable, a week or two after that, they sent you off to boarding school with a whole group of people that you didn't even know. And then you talk about how you were constantly moving schools and shifting and living overseas, how you'd form these deep bond with people, but then they'd be ripped out of your lives and you'd literally never see them again. She goes, what's the thing you fear most? Snakes? No, Paul, down here. I said, I hate to say goodbye to people because it rips away part of my soul. And so in order to prevent saying goodbye, I just don't get close. She goes, you've kept people at a distance your entire life. You're amazing at treading water. She goes, you just keep floating above the water and you keep everything as if it's good, and you hide all of that stuff that's down deep. She goes, recently you've learned to dive deep and dig into some of those emotions, but when you dive down, you realize that that is a place that you're scared of. Because that's where the pain is. That's where the struggle is. Richard Rohr wrote this. He said, the optimism of sevens originates in the fear of depth, because in the depths they fear pain is lurking. Every single word of that is true, is spot on. Those goodbyes scare me to death. Diving into that depth of the soul is scary. It's like these emotions rise up, and I'm so used to just cracking a joke or saying something funny. She even said, you know how it is at our dinner table. As soon as somebody gets deep, you crack a joke, you dominate it, and then it moves away. I'm like, so you're saying you're married to Shallow Hal? And she said, you're doing it again. It's like a continual cycle. My nephew left for college this week on Monday. He's lived in our house for the last couple years. He's like a son to me. And when he left, I could feel myself welling up and getting emotional. And so I said something stupid. And then the emotions started to come up, and so I said something funny. And then as he's walking out the door, I gave him a hug, and I just said, I'm proud of you. I mean, it was really that, I'll see you next week. Okay, cool. And as he's leaving, I said, hey, I put something in your bag. What'd you put in my bag? Don't worry about it. I put it in your bag. And I had to make it stupid. Like, I had to go there. And so he texts me a couple hours later. He texts me this picture, which is nothing to you. It's a can of ginger ale. But a couple years ago when he moved in, I put that in his bed. The next day it was in my bed. The week after that, it was in his drawer. Then it was in my drawer. Then it was in his truck, and then in my truck. I think I took that stupid can to Africa one year. And I said, did that make you laugh or cry? And he said, both. I said, here's what that can means. It means I'm proud of you. I love you. And I'm sorry that I couldn't say that to your face, because I don't know how. You know, and so you look at the depths of who we are. And we have to, as humans, not as sevens, but as humans, to learn how to dive into the deep, into the pain, into the places that shape us. Because if you're constantly living up here, you're missing out on life. Richard Rohr writes about Jesus in this. He said, Matthew reports that shortly before his death, Jesus refused to drink the painkiller used at that time, a mixture of gall and wine. He suffered physically and spiritual pain, and at the end endured the deep pain of distance from God. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? This low point that Jesus lived and suffered through is the gateway to Easter joy. See, I've lived in the stories of Jesus where he walks on water and turns water into wine. Why not? But then you see Jesus diving into the pain. And that's what makes the reality of Easter so powerful. Because somebody like me gets stuck with the happiness of Jesus and the goodness of Jesus, which is a beautiful thing. But sometimes when you dive deeper into the sorrow, into the pain, and his willingness to go there challenges somebody like me to go, I've got to figure out how to dive deep. In 15 minutes, I'm getting in a vehicle and driving my daughter Emma to college. What's a joke? Think of something funny. That. And she's my child who we've always wrestled. She's the jujitsu child where we'll just beat the living stuffing out of each other. She shoved my head in the refrigerator once, and so I slammed it. She's that kid. And I think about taking her and dropping her off and having to say goodbye. As a parent, it's like, man, just stay little. Like, I'll pay you monthly. And yet, if I do that, I rob her of her journey. I rob her of her stories, of her experiences. And if I'm not allowing myself to dive there, then I miss out on that journey of being able to see her flourish and grow and do these amazing things. And I'm telling you, this 7 journey has just torn me apart. And I've realized I do have a heart. And I can go there. And I can seek out those emotions. And I can learn from those pains. And I can grow from those struggles. And I can find the beauty in Jesus and how he loves me in spite of the fact that I will desperately do everything I can to avoid the pain. And yet when I live there, I find great joy. Thank you.